My name is Brenda Thompson, and I'm 65 years old. For 23 years, I worked 3 jobs to give my son David the education I never had. I scrubbed floors, waited tables, and sold merchandise just so he could walk across that graduation stage at Stanford University. I sat in that auditorium with tears of pride streaming down my face, watching my boy receive his diploma. But when he stood up to give his speech thanking the woman who raised him, he looked past me completely. Instead, he called another woman his mother. Little did I know that this moment would change everything between us forever. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you're watching from and hit that like button. This story will show you how sometimes standing up for yourself comes in the most unexpected ways. I still remember the day my world fell apart and began again all at once. David was just 8 years old when his father walked out on us, leaving nothing but empty promises and unpaid bills. That night, as I tucked my little boy into bed, I made a promise that would shape the next 15 years of my life. I would give him everything I never had, no matter what it cost me. The next morning, I started my first job as a waitress at Danny's Diner on Highway 12. The night shift paid better, so I worked from 10 p.m. until 6 a.m. serving coffee to truckers and insomniacs. My hands would shake from exhaustion, but the tips helped cover David's school supplies and clothes that actually fit him properly. By 7:30 a.m., I would rush home, wake David up, make his breakfast, and get him ready for school. Then I would drive him to Maple Elementary and head straight to my second job cleaning office buildings downtown. I scrubbed toilets, emptied trash cans, and vacuumed carpets until 3 p.m. The industrial cleaning chemicals made my skin crack and bleed, but I kept going because every dollar brought David closer to a better future. Weekends meant my third job at Montgomery's department store. I folded clothes, helped customers, and stood on my feet for 8 hours straight. My back would ache so badly that I could barely stand up straight, but I smiled through every shift because I knew David was at home doing his homework, preparing for the life I was building for him. Some nights, David would find me at the kitchen table paying bills by lamplight. He would ask me why I looked so tired, and I would smooth his hair and tell him it was so he could have a better life than mine. Those words became my mantra during the hardest moments when my body wanted to give up, but my heart wouldn't let me. I remember the winter when David was 12 and needed a new coat. I had been saving for weeks, putting aside $5 here and $10 there. When I finally had enough money, we went to the store together. He picked out a blue winter jacket that made him look so grown up. As I handed over the cash, mostly in 1s and 5s, David squeezed my hand and whispered thank you. In that moment, every sleepless night and every aching muscle felt worth it. The loneliness was perhaps the hardest part. Other mothers had husbands to share the burden, to take turns staying up with sick children or attending school events. I did everything alone, making every decision, handling every crisis, celebrating every victory by myself. But watching David grow into a smart, curious boy made every sacrifice meaningful. Those were the hardest years of my life, but also the most meaningful. As David entered his teenage years, something began to shift in our relationship. The boy who used to wait eagerly for me to come home from work now barely looked up from his homework when I walked through the door. I told myself this was normal, that teenagers needed space to become independent adults. Everything changed when David befriended Jason Whitmore at Roosevelt High School. The Whitmores lived in Westfield Estates, the kind of neighborhood where every lawn was perfectly manicured and every house had a 3-car garage. Jason's father owned a successful law firm, and his mother, Patricia, was everything I wasn't: elegant, educated, and refined in ways that money could buy. David started spending more and more time at the Whitmore house. At first, I was grateful that he had found such a nice family to spend time with. Patricia would call me occasionally to let me know David was staying for dinner or helping with some project. Her voice was always polite, but there was something in her tone that made me feel small, like I was the hired help rather than David's mother. The first time I went to pick David up from their house, I felt completely out of place. The Whitmore mansion sat at the end of a circular driveway with white columns and perfectly trimmed hedges. My old Honda Civic looked like a rust bucket parked next to their silver Mercedes and black BMW. When Patricia answered the door, she was wearing a cashmere sweater and pearl earrings that probably cost more than I made in a month. She smiled at me with the kind of politeness that felt like a wall. "Your son is always welcome here," she said. "He's such a bright boy. We love having him around." The way she said it made me feel like David belonged there more than he belonged with me. She invited me in for coffee, and I found myself sitting in their pristine living room, afraid to touch anything. David bounded down their spiral staircase, looking more at home in their house than he ever looked in ours. He had been doing homework in their library, he explained, because they had better reference books. He thanked Mrs. Whitmore for the snacks and gave her a hug goodbye. I watched this interaction with growing unease, seeing how natural and comfortable he seemed with her. On the drive home, David talked excitedly about the Whitmore family traditions, their weekend trips to their lake house, and the fascinating conversations he had with Mr. Whitmore about law and politics. I listened, trying to share his enthusiasm, but feeling more and more like an outsider in my own son's life. The changes in David became more apparent as months passed. He started using words I had never heard him use before, sophisticated vocabulary he must have picked up from the Whitmores. He would correct my grammar, sometimes gently but noticeably. When I served dinner on our regular plates, he would mention how the Whitmores used different forks for different courses. The moment that broke my heart came during his junior year. David had been selected for the National Honor Society, and there was going to be an induction ceremony at school. I was so proud, and I had already arranged to take time off from work to attend. But when I mentioned it to David, he looked uncomfortable and said, "Mom, can you not come to school events anymore? People might ask questions." I felt like he had slapped me across the face. "Questions about what?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. He was embarrassed by me, by our modest home, by my calloused hands and tired eyes. He was embarrassed by the mother who had sacrificed everything for him. David mumbled something about how it wasn't a big deal, and maybe it was better if I didn't take time off work anyway. I swallowed my tears and told him I understood, but inside, my heart was breaking. I went to that ceremony anyway, sitting in the back row where he couldn't see me watching my son receive his honor while pretending his own mother didn't exist. That night, I cried myself to sleep, wondering where I had gone wrong and hoping that someday he would understand the price of everything he was taking for granted. When David's acceptance letter from Stanford University arrived, I cried tears of joy and terror at the same time. Stanford was his dream school, and seeing that acceptance letter felt like validation for every sacrifice I had made. But the financial reality hit me like a freight train when I saw the tuition costs. I had saved what I could over the years, but it wasn't nearly enough. I took out loans that would keep me in debt for the rest of my life. I picked up additional shifts wherever I could find them. I started cleaning houses for wealthy families on Sundays, my supposed day of rest. Every penny I earned went toward David's education, his dorm fees, his meal plan, and his books. The calls from California became less and less frequent. At first, David would phone every few days to tell me about his classes, his roommates, and campus life. I treasured those conversations, living vicariously through his experiences at one of the most prestigious universities in the country. But gradually, the calls became weekly, then bi-weekly, then monthly, if I was lucky. I continued sending him money every month without fail. Sometimes it meant skipping meals or walking to work instead of driving to save on gas, but I never missed a payment. David would send brief text messages acknowledging the money transfers, treating them like automatic deposits rather than sacrifices from his mother's heart. It was during his sophomore year that I discovered his social media accounts. I had finally learned how to use Facebook mainly to see pictures of David and feel connected to his life from 3,000 miles away. What I found there shattered what was left of my heart. Photo after photo showed David with the Whitmore family. Christmas morning at their house, summer vacations at their lake cottage, formal dinners, where David wore suits I couldn't afford to buy him. But it was the captions that truly hurt. In one photo from Thanksgiving, David had written, "Grateful for my second mom, who taught me about grace and sophistication." The comments from his Stanford friends made everything worse. "You're so lucky to have such a refined mother," one girl wrote. "Mrs. Whitmore is absolutely elegant," another added. "She raised you well," said a third. I scrolled through dozens of similar comments, each one feeling like a knife twisting deeper into my chest. I tried calling David after seeing those photos, but he was always too busy to talk. He had study groups, internship interviews, social events with his fraternity brothers. The few times we did speak, our conversations felt stilted and awkward. He would mention things Mrs. Whitmore had taught him about wine pairing, or proper etiquette, comparing her wisdom favorably to my practical life lessons about hard work and perseverance. The final blow came during the spring of his senior year. I called to discuss plans for graduation, expecting to coordinate travel arrangements and maybe plan a small celebration dinner. Instead, David's voice was hesitant and uncomfortable when he said, "Mom, I'm not sure you should come to graduation. It's pretty formal, and well, I know how expensive it would be for you to travel out here." I felt my world crumble. After 23 years of sacrifice, after working 3 jobs and going into debt to pay for his education, my own son was uninviting me to his college graduation. I sat in stunned silence for a long moment before finding my voice. "David," I said quietly, "I'll be there. I've earned that right." Graduation day arrived with perfect California sunshine. I had used the last of my savings to buy a plane ticket and had spent weeks choosing the right outfit. I settled on a navy blue dress I found at a consignment shop, simple but dignified, with low heels that wouldn't hurt my feet after years of standing at work. I did my own hair and makeup carefully, wanting to look like the proud mother I was. I arrived at Stanford's campus early, overwhelmed by the grandeur of the university my sacrifices had helped my son attend. The ceremony was being held in the main quad, with hundreds of families gathering to celebrate their graduates. I found a seat in the middle section, close enough to see David clearly, but not so close that I might embarrass him with my presence. As I waited for the ceremony to begin, I watched the other families around me. Fathers in expensive suits adjusted professional cameras. Mothers wearing designer dresses compared notes about their children's post-graduation plans. I felt out of place among all this wealth and sophistication, but I reminded myself that I had every right to be there. When the graduates filed in wearing their black caps and gowns, I spotted David immediately. He looked so handsome and grown up, walking with confidence across the same campus I had helped him reach through years of sacrifice. My heart swelled with pride as I watched him take his seat with his classmates, even though he hadn't acknowledged my presence. The ceremony proceeded with speeches from faculty members and distinguished guests. I listened politely, but I was really just waiting for the moment when David would receive his diploma. When his name was called, David Michael Thompson, Bachelor of Science in Computer Engineering. I stood up and clapped louder than anyone else in that auditorium. But then came the part of the ceremony I hadn't expected. Several graduating students had been selected to give brief speeches about their college experience and the people who had supported them along the way. David was one of those selected speakers. I watched my son walk to the podium with pride, anticipating the moment when he would acknowledge the journey that had brought him to this day. He looked confident and articulate as he began to speak about the importance of education and the people who had shaped his character. "I want to thank the woman who raised me," David said into the microphone, his voice carrying across the quad. I felt tears welling up in my eyes as I prepared to stand and acknowledge his words. This was the moment I had been waiting for, when my son would finally recognize everything I had done for him. But then he continued. "Mrs. Patricia Whitmore, who showed me what it means to have class and dignity. She opened her home and her heart to me teaching me lessons about grace and sophistication that I will carry with me for the rest of my life. I felt the world stop spinning. Patricia Whitmore stood up in the front row, elegant in her cream-colored suit, waving graciously at the crowd as if she were indeed a proud mother. The audience applauded enthusiastically, and I could hear people around me murmuring about how lovely she looked and how fortunate David was to have such a refined mother figure. David continued his speech, praising the Whitmore family for their guidance and support, for showing him a world beyond his humble beginnings, for investing in his future with their wisdom and resources. He talked about their family dinners, where he learned about art and literature, their trips to museums and concerts that expanded his cultural horizons. Not once did he mention my name. Not once did he acknowledge the woman who had worked 3 jobs for 15 years to pay for the very education he was receiving that day. In front of hundreds of people, my own son had erased 23 years of my life and replaced me with a woman who had given him comfort while I had given him everything. As David concluded his speech and returned to his seat, Patricia Whitmore continued to beam and accept congratulations from people around her. She looked every inch the proud mother, basking in the recognition for raising such an accomplished young man. Meanwhile, I sat frozen in my chair, invisible and forgotten, wondering how the child I had sacrificed everything for could betray me so completely. For several minutes after David's speech, I sat in my chair, unable to move or think clearly. The applause around me seemed to echo from a great distance as my mind tried to process what had just happened. My own son had publicly denied my existence, crediting another woman with the sacrifices I had made and the love I had given. I watched as Patricia Whitmore accepted congratulations from other parents, graciously nodding as people praised her for raising such a fine young man. She wore her role as David's surrogate mother, like a designer gown, elegant and perfectly fitted. Meanwhile, I remained invisible in my consignment store dress, the real mother who had been erased from her son's story. The memories flooded back in painful waves. I remembered the night David had pneumonia when he was 10, and I sat beside his bed for 3 days straight, missing work and losing pay to nurse him back to health. I remembered saving for months to buy him a computer for high school, eating peanut butter sandwiches for lunch so I could afford the monthly payments. I remembered working Christmas Eve at the department store so I could buy him the graphing calculator he needed for advanced mathematics. All those moments, all those sacrifices, all those years of putting his needs before my own had been reduced to nothing. In David's version of his life story, I was apparently not worth mentioning. The woman who had given him everything had been replaced by the woman who had given him refinement. As the ceremony continued and individual graduates were called to receive their diplomas, I watched David's face. He was smiling and laughing with his classmates, completely comfortable in this world of privilege and prestige. When his turn came to walk across the stage, he strode confidently to receive his diploma, shaking hands with the university president and posing for official photographs. But what happened next was the final straw. After all the graduates had received their diplomas, families began gathering on the lawn for pictures and celebrations. I watched from my seat as David made his way through the crowd, not toward me, but toward the Whitmore family. Patricia opened her arms wide, and David embraced her, as if she were indeed his mother. Mr. Whitmore patted his back proudly, and their entire extended family surrounded David for photograph after photograph. I realized that David had no intention of acknowledging me at all. In his mind, this day belonged to the people who had given him social status, not the person who had given him life and opportunity. He was planning to leave this graduation ceremony without even speaking to the woman who had made it all possible. That was the moment I made my decision. I stood up slowly, smoothing my dress and taking a deep breath. 23 years of being invisible. 23 years of being taken for granted, 23 years of sacrificing everything for a son who was now ashamed of me, had come to an end. I walked down the steps of the bleachers with purpose, my heart pounding, but my resolve absolute. I was not going to sit quietly in the shadows while another woman received credit for my life's work. I was not going to let my son erase me from his story without consequences. As I approached the group gathered around David and the Whitmores, conversations began to quiet, and heads began to turn. I could feel people looking at me curiously, wondering who this woman was and why she was walking so purposefully toward the celebration. When I reached the edge of their family circle, I stopped and spoke in a clear, calm voice that cut through the chatter around us. "Excuse me," I said, looking directly at David and Patricia. "I think there's been a misunderstanding." The effect of my words was immediate and dramatic. Conversation stopped mid-sentence as people turned to look at me. David's face went pale, and Patricia Whitmore looked confused, as if trying to place where she had seen me before. The photographer who had been taking family pictures lowered his camera, sensing that something significant was happening. "I'm Brenda Thompson," I continued, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. "David's actual mother." The silence that followed was deafening. I could feel dozens of eyes on me as people processed what I had just said. David opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. Patricia's perfectly composed expression faltered for the first time since I had known her. "Mom," David finally whispered, his voice barely audible. "What are you doing here?" The question hit me like a physical blow. What was I doing here? I was attending my son's graduation, something I had every right to do after working 3 jobs for 15 years to make this day possible. But instead of explaining this to David privately, I found myself surrounded by strangers who were now witnessing our family drama unfold. "I'm here," I said, my voice growing stronger, "because I paid for this education with 3 jobs and 20 years of my life." I reached into my purse and pulled out a folder I had brought with me containing years of documents I had never expected to need. I opened it and began removing receipts, bank statements, and loan papers. "These are the receipts from Stanford University," I said, holding up the papers for everyone to see. "Every semester's tuition paid by Brenda Thompson. Every dorm fee, every meal plan, every textbook allowance. While you were enjoying dinner parties and wine tastings with the Whitmores, I was working double shifts at Danny's Diner to make sure these bills got paid." The crowd around us had grown larger as people stopped their own celebrations to watch our confrontation. I could see phone cameras being raised discreetly, capturing this moment that I knew would haunt us both for years to come. Patricia Whitmore finally found her voice. "Perhaps we should discuss this privately," she said, her tone still polite but with an edge of panic. "There's no need to make a scene." I turned to face her directly. "No, Mrs. Whitmore. This needs to be said publicly, just like his speech needed to be given publicly. You see, David just told several hundred people that you raised him, that you taught him everything important about life. He thanked you for your love and guidance while completely forgetting the woman who actually sacrificed everything for him." I could see the shock and embarrassment on Patricia's face as she realized what had happened. To her credit, she looked genuinely uncomfortable with the situation, as if she had never intended to replace me in David's affections. David tried to interrupt. "Mom, you're embarrassing me," he said urgently. "Can we please talk about this later?" The irony of his words was not lost on me. "I'm embarrassing you?" I asked, my voice rising slightly. "After everything I've done, after every sacrifice I've made, I'm the one embarrassing you." I turned back to address the growing crowd around us. "Let me tell you about embarrassment," I said. "Embarrassment is working 3 jobs and still not being able to afford the clothes that would make you fit in with your son's friends' families. Embarrassment is having hands so cracked from cleaning chemicals that you're ashamed to shake hands with other parents. Embarrassment is discovering that your son is so ashamed of you that he's replaced you with someone who never changed his diapers, never sat up all night when he had fever, never worked Christmas Eve, so he could have presents under the tree." The crowd was completely silent now, hanging on every word. I could see other mothers in the audience looking at me with recognition and sympathy, perhaps thinking about their own relationships with their children. I worked as a waitress from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., then cleaned office buildings until 3 in the afternoon, then sold clothes on weekends. I continued. I did this for 15 years so that David could have the opportunities I never had. I went into debt that I'll be paying off until the day I die so he could attend this university. And today, at his graduation ceremony, he thanked another woman for raising him. I looked directly at David, who was staring at the ground, unable to meet my eyes. I raised a son, I said quietly, but somewhere along the way, I lost him to people who gave him comfort, not character. The aftermath of my confrontation played out in ways I never could have anticipated. After delivering my final words, I walked away from the graduation celebration with as much dignity as I could muster, leaving David and the Whitmore family to deal with the awkward silence and staring crowd I had created. I spent that night in a modest hotel near the airport, crying harder than I had cried since the day my husband left us. Part of me felt vindicated for finally standing up for myself, but another part of me was devastated that it had come to this. I had raised my voice in anger to my son for the first time in his life, and I had done it in front of hundreds of strangers. The next morning, I flew back home to Pennsylvania, uncertain about what the future held for my relationship with David. I had said things that could never be unsaid, exposed wounds that might never heal. But I had also spoken truth that needed to be heard, even if the delivery had been more dramatic than I had intended. 3 days after I returned home, I received a call from my neighbor asking if I had seen the internet lately. It turned out that someone at the graduation had recorded my confrontation with David and posted it on social media. The video had gone viral with millions of views and thousands of comments from people around the world. Reading through the comments was an emotional roller coaster. Hundreds of mothers shared their own stories of ungrateful children who had forgotten their sacrifices. Single parents wrote about working multiple jobs and feeling invisible in their children's lives. Adult children posted apologies to their own mothers, saying the video had made them realize how much they had taken for granted. But there were also harsh critics who said I had embarrassed my son unnecessarily, that family drama should be handled privately, that I had damaged our relationship beyond repair. These comments stung, but they were far outnumbered by messages of support from people who understood what it felt like to be erased from their own children's stories. A week after the graduation, my phone rang. When I saw David's name on the caller ID, my heart started racing. I almost didn't answer, afraid of what he might say, but I knew we needed to talk eventually. Mom. His voice was quiet and subdued. I'm sorry. Those 2 words opened a floodgate of emotion that I had been holding back since graduation day. David talked for nearly an hour, explaining how he had gotten caught up in the Whitmore family's world and had gradually begun to see our humble life as something to be ashamed of rather than proud of. He admitted that Patricia Whitmore had become a mother figure to him, but said he now realized that in embracing her guidance, he had unconsciously rejected mine. He talked about how the pressure to fit in with his wealthy classmates had made him want to distance himself from his working-class roots. I never meant to hurt you, he said, his voice breaking. I just wanted to belong somewhere, and the Whitmores made me feel like I could be someone important. But I forgot that you're the one who made me into someone worth being proud of in the first place. Our conversation was painful, but necessary. David acknowledged every sacrifice I had made, every job I had worked, every dollar I had borrowed to give him opportunities. He said he had taken our video conversation as a wake-up call, forcing him to confront how far he had drifted from the values I had taught him. 2 weeks later, Patricia Whitmore called me. Her voice was sincere and apologetic as she explained that she had never intended to replace me in David's life. She said she had genuinely cared for David and had tried to provide him with experiences and guidance that she thought would benefit him, but she now realized that her influence had unintentionally driven a wedge between us. She asked if there was anything she could do to help repair the damage, and I appreciated her honesty and concern. We talked for a long time about David's future and agreed that he needed to rebuild his relationship with me without her interference. The healing process was slow and sometimes difficult. David moved back to Pennsylvania after graduation, turning down a high-paying job in California to spend time reconnecting with his roots and with me. He got a position with a local tech company and moved into a small apartment 15 minutes from my house. We started having dinner together every Sunday, something we hadn't done since he was in high school. During those meals, we talked about everything we had missed during his years away. David asked me about the jobs I had worked, the sacrifices I had made, and the dreams I had put aside for his sake. For the first time in years, he seemed genuinely interested in my life and my experiences. Gradually, David began to understand the true cost of his education and the depth of my love for him. He started helping me with bills and household repairs, saying he wanted to give back some of what I had given him. More importantly, he began speaking about me with the same pride and affection he had once reserved for the Whitmore family. That day at Stanford had taught us both valuable lessons about love, respect, and the price of forgetting where you come from. I learned that sometimes you have to demand the recognition you deserve, even when it's uncomfortable or awkward. David learned that sophistication without gratitude is just selfishness dressed up in expensive clothes. Sometimes love means letting people see who they really are, even when it hurts. That day, I didn't just stand up for myself. I stood up for every parent who sacrificed everything and deserved to be honored, not hidden. What would you have done in my situation? Have you ever felt invisible in your own family's story? Share your thoughts in the comments below, because I'd love to hear from you. If this story touched your heart, please hit the like button and subscribe for more real-life stories about family love and finding the courage to stand up for yourself. Share this video with someone who needs to remember that every mother's sacrifice deserves recognition. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember that your worth is never determined by how others choose to see you. Stay strong, and I'll see you in the next video.